Welcome to another episode of Perspectives on Tyranny, a podcast of Regimes Museum in Orange County, California. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Chilean coup d'etat. On September 11, 1973, military forces backed by the U.S. and led by General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the Chilean government headed by President Salvador Allende, a democratic socialist. For nearly 2 decades, General Pinochet presided over a brutal dictatorship that saw political opponents imprisoned and tortured, thousands killed, and many who simply disappeared, never to be heard from again. Political parties were disbanded, labor unions were suppressed, elections were canceled, and the media was heavily censored. Pinochet stepped down from power in 1990 after the country held a major referendum where just over half of Chileans voted against continued military rule. Still, he remained commander-in-chief of the army until 1998. That year, Pinochet was arrested in London on a court order of a Spanish judge. He died in 2006 at the age of 91 while awaiting trial. With some 300 criminal charges pending against him, he was never prosecuted and never spent a day in jail. Even though Pinochet is dead and half a century has passed since the coup, the scars of this tragic era remain for the thousands who lived through the horror and feel justice was never really achieved. To help us understand this dark chapter of Chilean history, we speak with Dr. Andrés Solimano, an economist and historian based in Santiago, Chile, who lived through these events. Dr. Solimano holds a PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has worked for many prestigious institutions, including the World Bank. He's also the author of many books focusing on the social inequalities of neoliberalism, a political ideology that took root in Chile years before it was implemented in the United States and the United Kingdom. Hope you enjoy. A lot of Americans aren't that familiar with Chilean history, so orient us so we understand the context in which Pinochet arose.
Well, I would say Chile got independent from the Spanish rule in 1810, and then there was another round in 1818, and Chile was part of the Spanish settlement in South America. After independence, remained quite unequal, and that's a persistent factor up to now in the country. The owners of land were not Spanish citizens anymore, in general, after independence, but there was a class of Chilean landowners, but still keeping a structure of ownership very concentrated. So the country obtained political independence, but economic transformation did not take much place in that area of ownership of land, and ownership of mineral resources, etc. The country was dependent and still dependent on mineral product. It was nitrate first and then copper. In terms of foreign influence, the British were very important in the 19th century, early 20th century, and then the US as owners of productive wealth, mainly copper. In the 1960s, in the second half, with the Christian Democratic government led by President Frei Montalva, this government accelerated the process of social transformation with agrarian reform, with Chilenization of copper mines, with the boost of labor unions in the countryside, and that was accelerated during the Allende government. Allende was elected. It was the first neo-Marxist I sometimes hesitate to say he's a Marxist president in the sense that people tend to identify Marxists at that time with the Soviet Union or Cuba or Eastern Europe. And Allende, though was a man of the left of the Socialist Party, had a different conception of what would be a feasible socialism and desired socialism for a country like Chile. So it's important to consider that, because at that time of the Cold War, there were divisions between the Soviet area, the area of influence, and the American area of influence. Chile was in the American area of influence, but was not opting for a sort of Soviet model with Allende. But Allende nationalized companies. 92 companies was in the program, were nationalized the financial sector, accelerated agrarian reform, and nationalized the copper mines. But that was fully approved by Congress, from right-wing, center to left, in 1971. At the same time, the government started to run problems in terms of inflation, because the state-owned, the occupied factories by the government and the workers started to run into losses that had to be financed by the treasury. So they started to print money. And also there was a lack of foreign exchange to import capital goods and intermediate parts, in part because the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank stopped largely their lending to Chile, to Allende, pressed by the government of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. There was a Republican government at the time that were frightened by the election of socialists like Allende in Chile. And also they started to develop a strategy of destabilization of the government, of the type of the João Goulart government in Brazil or Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in the 1956 that led to overthrow of Arbenz, overthrow of João Goulart in Brazil in 1964. So the Allende government started to be entangled in a fight, so to speak, with the U.S. government led by Nixon, that also was not happy with the nationalization of copper mines in Chile.
Well, all this is going on during the Allende years. Tell me about the institution of the military prior to Allende, from its founding up through the 60s and then into the Allende years. How was the military structured and how did it change under Allende?
Yeah, well, the military in Chile followed a more Prussian model coming from Germany, Prussian. In the 19th century, there was a government, a military organized by the New Republic, as different from the military system that existed when there were the Spaniards in Chile. And the military played some role in Chilean politics in the 19th century, more in a relatively conservative direction. In the 20th century, the army was used from time to time to repress labor movements. So there was a progressive labor military movement in the mid-1920s that forced the approval of a more progressive constitution, and they were not conservative, were middle rank, upper middle rank officials. So not always the Chilean army was conservative right-wing. But in the 50s and 60s, coinciding with the Cold War, they started to develop very close relations with the army or the defense sector in the U.S. And then there was this development of the national security doctrine, which was that the army should play a role in avoiding communist infiltration in the countries, and that the main threat for national security was left-wing politics, workers' movement, communist parties, etc.
So prior to the Cold War, they were kind of subservient to politics?
Yes. Well, actually, until the coup d'etat of 1973, September 11, 1973, in general, Chilean army and armed forces in general were quite obedient to the civilian governments. In general, there was not an active participation in politics of the Chilean armed forces. At the same time, they started to be more indoctrinated in these ideas of national security against an internal enemy, supposed internal enemy.
And that enemy is communism.
That enemy at the time was communism, internal subversion, supposedly communist. Still, the Chilean Communist Party, at its height, never had more than 15% of the national votes in elections. And it was a country always that participated in elections, parliamentary elections, presidential elections, majors elections. It was a party that played by the rules of representative democracy. So it was not an insurgent party at all. But that was an ideology that started to develop in the army. Still, during the Allende government, there were several top officials that were sympathetic with the government and that were not engaged in a military putsch. They were constitutional generals. The most important one was General Carlos Prats, who was a commander-in-chief of the army until August 1973, when they appointed Pinochet. Allende appointed Pinochet, by the way. Pinochet was like the second or third oldest in the army.
So tell us about Pinochet's background leading up to the Allende years, how they broke down leading up to the coup d'etat.
Well, Pinochet was not a well-known figure in the army. His name almost never appeared in the press, in the public, etc. It was like third, fourth rank. There was an attempt of military coup on June 29th of 1973. They called tanquetazo, by the tanks of a regiment that went outside, started to try to cope to take over the presidential palace. And that was, the coup was averted by the General Prats and also by General Pinochet and loyalist generals that protected Allende, avoided the presidential palace to be taken over by the rebel troops, and they squashed the attempt. When Pinochet appeared in that incident as a loyalist to Allende. So it was a surprise for most of the people, including for Allende, the morning of the coup d'etat, that Pinochet was behind the coup. All historical records suggest that he jumped over the wagon of the coup, the conspiration against Pinochet in the last days the coup was launched.
How did he switch so quickly?
Allende appointed him as the commander-in-chief of the army 3 weeks before the coup d'etat, because all the reports were that he was a loyalist. And he was always cooperative with Allende. He never expressed criticism of his government. So Allende had full confidence of him until the day of the coup d'etat.
So we have the coup. It's what is essentially Chile's 9/11. But based on what I've read, it seems like it was so quick. How did they plan for this, take over the whole country in what seems like such a short amount of time?
Yes, well, there was no armed resistance to the coup d'etat. There was some here and there, but there was no parallel army supporting Allende. Allende never wanted to create a parallel army to the official army. He also refused to give arms to the workers. And there were demands that, as the rumors increased the last 2-3 months of the government, that there was a military plot against him, the workers' organization started to ask Allende, well, we need to defend the constitutional government. But Allende was also frightened of the possibility of a civil war. He would always, until the end, try to avoid a civil war like the one that happened in Spain, 36, 39. He also thought that there were several generals that were loyalists. Now, the army, the armed forces, also the Navy and the National Police and the Air Force, basically controlled the situation after 4 or 5 hours of the start of the coup. There were focus of resistance in factories, in popular neighborhoods, in the universities. Yes, I still remember it was my last year in high school. When there were the news of the coup, we kind of occupied the school, but then after a few hours, we realized that it was too dangerous, so we left. Because there was no parallel armed defense of the government, nothing like that. So the army was able to have full control of the country during the day of the coup. Though there were resistance in the countryside, in some factories, in universities, etc., but not of the magnitude that could revert the situation. In military terms, it was clear that the victory was for Pinochet and the army that decided to stage the coup. And also, they started with the heavy repression. They created a system of prison camps in the National Stadium, another stadium in Santiago, in Concepcion, in La Serena. They bombed all the antennas of the radios that were supportive of Allende. They closed down Congress, and they imposed a very strict press censorship system. It was a full military occupation of the country by its own army. It was clear that there were no chances to revert the situation or to change the outcome of the coup. The coup imposed itself rapidly. But the army was very, in general, there was very violent repression and censorships and also search. They went to many houses and universities to search for people to take them prisoners and sending them to concentration camps.
Were the people who were targeted, were they mostly involved in politics, like left-wing activists, or was everyone fair game? Did they target everybody?
Well, apparently the military started to prepare lists of left-wing militants and of political parties, activists before the coup. So they went after that group. But it was pretty massive, because they did search of factories that were most of them occupied by the workers or nationalized, and also was created a system of cordones industriales, a network of industries in the popular neighborhoods that were coordinated in the case of an insurrection, not militarily, but in terms of information, etc. So they did search and they arrested workers just because they were workers working in factories, and also students. Most of the students were supporters of Allende in the universities. So it was pretty massive.
Do we have reliable figures on the number of people who went missing, the so-called disappeared?
Well, there is an official list of around 1,000 people that are what's called disappeared. That people that there is evidence that they were arrested by the military or the secret police, because Pinochet created the secret police called DINA, the National Directorate of Intelligence, which had civilians and military that started to operate as a political police. There is evidence people that were arrested that they never came back to their homes. So that fell into the category of disappeared because they were not officially declared dead. They entered into a sort of legal limbo because they were arrested and they never appeared again alive. But they were not declared dead or their remains were not handed over to their families. They just disappeared out of thin air. That list is around, according to the National Reconciliation Commission that started to operate in 1990, of around 1,200 people, 1,500 people. But the number of arrests could be as high as 40, 50,000 or more. And also exile. Many people went to exile outside the country. So it was a very complicated history in terms of human rights violations.
How did they justify this legally? Have any kind of legal framework that they were using for this, or did they just turn it on its head and it was just complete fiat?
Well, first, Congress was closed and there was no free press. So it was there was a control in that sense. The judiciary remained in place, in part because the judiciary was considered more conservative, and the Supreme Court judges, in general, were supportive of Pinochet, in general. So they decided to keep but many cases of habeas corpus, if somebody is arrested, there's a law against arbitrary arrest. And so when people started to be arrested, families piling for habeas corpus, and there were most of the cases denied by the judiciary. So legal judiciary protection was very weak, particularly the first 5 years of the Pinochet regime. The regime lasted 17 years. Then the situation started a little bit to relax or to change in some ways. In the 1980s, there started to take place many national protest movements, strikes, and people going to the streets against the military regime, demanding the restoration of democracy. So the regime was in control, but facing sharp opposition. So they couldn't do whatever they wanted, like in the 70s, from 73 to 1980 or 82, I would say. From 1973 to 82, it was complete control of the military of the country. In 83, they started the first national strikes and protest movements in popular neighborhoods, in the street, in the center of the main cities. So the situation for the military started to be less consolidated. At least they faced opposition. But that was also repressed.
Also, I imagine those first couple of years were terrifying and scared people into silence. How did they go from that to being a little braver to speak out and to protest in the 80s? Was there any catalyst that started these movements in the 80s?
Well, I remember the workers' union of the state-owned copper company, Codelco, were the first to call for a national strike against the military regime. That was, if I'm correct, February or January 1983. That coincided with a severe economic crisis. Chile started an economic crisis in 81 that lasted until 83. Unemployment rate increased to 20%. There was a devaluation of the currency. There was a banking crisis. So the economic situation deteriorated very sharply in those years. And that was a catalyst for the people to turn openly to challenge the regime, asking for a recovery of the economy and a restoration of democracy. And this was led by the labor union of the main copper companies. And they received a very positive response from different quarters. They never expected that. So they started to coalesce a social movement that was largely dormant for 10 years. I think it was ignited by the economic crisis, and also people that was tired by the lack of personal freedoms and liberties and this very harsh system of not tolerating any dissent. So people was tired of that.
That's on the political front, but I guess throughout the worst years of the regime, so 73 to 82, as you said, what was the impact on just relationships, families, home life, the psychology of living under that regime? What did it do to the social fabric?
Well, it was a sort of traumatized society in a way, because Chile was not used to military coups, because the last military intervention was short-lived and not a dictatorship in 1925 by progressive military officers. So there was no experience before of having military occupation of the same country. And also the coup was very violent in the sense that they bombed the presidential palace. President Allende died in the coup, in the presidential palace. Early that morning, he left his home and went to the presidential palace and started to resist the uprising with his bodyguards and some loyalists, part of the national police that were still left there. Then there are versions that committed suicide, and there are other versions that he was killed when the palace was assaulted. Well, but the Air Force bombed the presidential palace, the Chilean Air Force, and then massive detention camps. So that affected the psyche of Chilean society. People started to live in a state of permanent insecurity.
What was it like for you and your family and your relationships with people?
Yeah, well, you had to be careful of what you say in public or with whom, because these regimes operate with secret police and with informants that can report this person is making a dissident plans, etc. It was rough. I entered the university to study economics. I went to Catholic University, which was not that much affected by the coup like the Chilean University, which was more state-owned. Yeah, I was lucky in the sense that I did my undergraduate studies under relative situation of normality, because the university was a small school that never had a tradition of engaging politics, so it was a little bit isolated from the rest of the situation of the country, but you were living in the country, so you had to be careful at the time.
So you entered university right at the time that there was these big economic reforms, right? The so-called Chicago Boys. Was that being taught in the school at the time?
Yes, I started economics in 1974. And in 1975, Milton Friedman, the professor of the University of Chicago in the US, visited Chile and met General Pinochet and delivered a document proposing economic shock treatment to reduce inflation, to open the economy to international trade, to deregulate markets, and to control tightly the labor unions. As I was in Catholic University, which there were several professors from the Chicago School of Economics, he went to our faculty and delivered a talk, which I attended in March of 75, in which he made a diagnosis of the economic situation in Chile, the way he understood it, and he made some recommendations, which he prepared a report and met personally General Pinochet and delivered the report to General Pinochet, who was the head of the military junta. That almost cost Milton Friedman the Nobel Prize in Economics, which was given to him in 76, his association with Pinochet, or at least his willingness to advise Pinochet, to meet him personally and give economic advice. But at that time, I was invited as a student to his talk. I met him, I shook hands, hello, Professor Keith Friedman, etc. The whole thing lasted 2 hours. And then I read in the press that he met General Pinochet 2 days after or so.
Well, now all that was going on, when you were watching Milton Friedman and seeing these reforms take place, did you grasp at that age that these so-called neoliberal ideas, how impactful they were going to be for the next couple of decades?
It was difficult to do that. I mean, Chile was one of the first countries that started to experience with neoliberal economics during the Pinochet regime, because the other experience were Margaret Thatcher in the US, 79, 80, basically the 1980s, Ronald Reagan in the US. But in terms of developing countries like Chile, well, there were shock treatments led by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund before, but not as a closed system ideology of free market like the one that Friedman was proposing in Chile. Friedman realized that his ideas could be applied in Chile because there was like a social experiment. They could apply policies that did not go through a parliamentary discussion in Congress because Congress was closed. There was no opposition from labor unions open because the military was controlling the labor movement. There was not to be much press criticism. So the ideas that were not tested, not tried, like privatization, rapid trade liberalization, etc., the regulation of the financial system, they were at the time in the mid-70s were not being applied in other countries in this form. So Chile became like a guinea pig country where you could experiment with that because there was no normal democracy operating after the coup.
Why would these ideas be attractive to the Pinochet regime?
I think two things. The shock treatment that Friedman proposed, the neoliberal ideas, put a strong emphasis on controlling labor unions because Friedman said, no, this is a sort of wage push. You are having inflation because at the time of the military coup, Chile had a high inflation and the high inflation remained for 6 years. It was not easy to stabilize inflation, to reduce inflation. It took between 4 or 5 years to bring inflation from 300% per year to 30% per year, let's say. That was the rate of inflation in 81. So Friedman said, no, but this inflation is coming in part because of wage push. So you cannot tolerate labor union asking for higher wages. How to control that? And that helped Pinochet to control the labor movement because Pinochet realized that the main source of support of Allende was the labor movement. So it helped to counteract that. The other thing is that Chile had a complicated fiscal situation, fiscal deficit. Revenues were less than expenditure. And Friedman said, you have to close that gap. You have to reduce immediately the fiscal deficit. And in 1975, 100,000 public servants were laid off, put on the streets. Friedman was very tough on that, saying, you cannot have this big public sector. Friedman also recommended Pinochet return the intervened companies to the previous owners, which Pinochet started to do that after the coup. But Friedman said they gave more a logic, economic logic. Look, these countries are running losses, handed them over to the private sector, privatized them. All those things sounded appealing to Pinochet, I believe. And also Friedman had a team, which were his former students, that started to get positions in the military regime. So Pinochet said, here there is a team of guys with PhD in economics, master degrees in economics from the University of Chicago, well-trained, and they have their ideological father or their guru, their professor, Professor Friedman, that will help them, advise them how to manage the economy. So Pinochet probably said, okay, I will hand over to these guys the management of the economy because Friedman is behind and these guys have academic credentials. they're coming back to Chile with PhDs in economics and all that, and speaking in technical language. So all those things were appealing to Pinochet.
Let's go back to the 1980s and what becomes the downfall of Pinochet. You had a very important referendum in 1988, which was should he stay in power another 8 years, yes or no? Why would he allow that? Or what were the circumstances that led to that vote?
Well, there were several factors, I think, to consider. First, the economic crisis of the 1980s created an opposition to the regime. And there were 2-3 years, very rough national protest movements from 83 to 85, 86. In 86, there was an attempt to kill Pinochet near Santiago, which Pinochet escaped alive. So it was clear that the political situation needed a change. Also, I think the U.S. government that supported Pinochet the initial years, at least until Henry Kissinger came to Chile in 75 or 76 and gave open support to Pinochet. When Nixon left because of the Watergate scandal, and also then came Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was president of the U.S. at the time. Gerald Ford probably was not as sanguine in favor of Pinochet as Nixon, but he didn't care too much and left Kissinger to manage the situation. Then it came Jimmy Carter and his human rights ideas, say no, let's stop these things. The U.S. cannot back military dictatorships in Latin America and Pinochet. So the American government started to change their opinion. By the 80s, even with Reagan, they started to distance themselves from Pinochet. So the U.S. government supported a transition to democracy in Chile in the late 80s. I think that also gave a signal to the opposition parties, Christian Democratic Party, Socialist Party, other parties, that the U.S. was giving green light to political change in Chile by the time of the plebiscite. And after the plebiscite was won by the opposition, the year after, there was the call for national elections. And it won a Christian Democrat that was the first elected president after Pinochet. So I would say a difficult internal political situation. The economy was recovering, but still the situation was not easy. And the international scenario had changed compared to the early 70s, mid-70s, where the U.S. was supporting national security governments, military dictatorships, overthrowing left-wing governments. That was the official stance of U.S. government in the late 80s, early 90s.
So this 1988 referendum, the yes was 44%, no was nearly 56%. 44% still sounds like a lot. So the people that wanted to keep Pinochet in power, what was their rationale? If you were to speak to those people and you say, why do you still support Pinochet after all this time, what would their answer be? What were people saying at the time?
This is a good question, a good observation. Yeah, it's very high percentage for authoritarian regime to have support from the population. Now, you have to see the context. There was no free press from 73 to 88, 15 years of no free press. So the people was just listening one side of the story, the official story of the military. We came to power, we put order and discipline to this country, we stabilized the economy, we started to have positive economic growth, progress. So why don't you trust these leftists? We need a strong man to keep the country progressing. That was more or less the official storyline. In a context where you don't have other positions in the press, in the TVs, in the newspapers, that affects the public opinion, I think, in one certain direction. It's not that the people are all authoritarian, 44% of the Chilean population is non-democratic, etc. No, it's more complicated. Probably people, they don't have a high degree of political culture. They have not read too much in terms of what is democracy, what is a dictatorship, the history of the country, and also at schools and universities were tightly controlled, and also the scope for discussion, for dissent, was not much. And also this rhetoric and simple story, look, we are leading a country that there is peace, there is order, there is an economy that delivering the goods to some extent, though income distribution was very unequal. Almost all the Pinochet period was with high unemployment. It never went down below 15-14% of open unemployment. In spite of hardship for the people, they played the ghost of the years of high inflation during Allende, the occupation of the factories, etc.
When you say it like that, it's surprising that the no vote won in the end when you lack an opposition press. So that vote happens, Pinochet ends power in 1990. And after that, from 1990 to his arrest in 1998, what was Pinochet doing in the 90s, and then what was happening in Chile more broadly?
Well, in March of 1990, there was the official restoration of democracy, so to speak. It's not that easy that you restore democracy from one day to the next, more evolutionary process. But political parties were legalized, Congress opened activities, there were elections for senators and deputies. Newspapers with different views started to spring up. So there was a restoration of democracy. Now, Pinochet, in the negotiations between the military, the party military, and the new government that was incoming, negotiated that Pinochet was to sit as a senator for life. He was have a seat in the Chilean Senate until he would pass away for all his remaining life. He received salary and other prerogatives. And also, very importantly for him, that would guarantee him immunity from prosecution by a potential human rights court. And also, he remained as the commander-in-chief of the army. He was not removed. So Pinochet kept a very powerful position. And then the democratic government, economic policies had a degree of continuity between Pinochet period and post-Pinochet. Privatizations of public-owned enterprises were not revised. The trade regime was not changed much, really. Financial integration with the rest of the world was maintained. Labor legislation did not change much. It was more or less the same labor legislation that remained in the Pinochet period, without a prosecution of labor unions, yes. But in legal terms, they could not negotiate by branch of economic activity, just at the firm level. So it was a weakened labor movement. That was maintained. That's important. And some privatization continued. Taxes were raised, but at moderate rate, because the new government started to spend more in social sectors and also increase public investment. So it started to be a neoliberal model with a human face, with social face. Neoliberalism remained. The privatization were not challenged. Even the privatization in education, in the health sector, in social security remained. And remain until today. And also, the economy also was growing. And the 1990s was a very good decade for Chile. So there was a sense of material progress, of job creation, and foreign investment also started to come in larger numbers to Chile because there was a government that ensured more social stability, social and political stability, without a radical change of the economic model. But for Pinochet, he was arrested in 1998. In London.
What led to his arrest, and why did it take so long?
He went for medical reasons, for a medical checkup to London. And he had tea with Margaret Thatcher, because Thatcher was very fond of Pinochet. Because Pinochet, that's the story, I'm not completely sure, sided more with the Argentinians, with the UK in the Malvinas War of 1981, providing intelligence, information, etc. from Punta Arenas. And so Mrs. Thatcher was supportive of Pinochet. But Juez Garzón in Spain activated some clauses on disappearance of Spanish and French citizens during the Pinochet regime and British citizens. So he issued an order of international arrest by Interpol that was taken by Scotland Yard in London. The story goes that some exiles conveyed information to Juez Garzón and Joan Garcés in Spain that Pinochet was in London. And Juez Garzón, from human rights, specialized in international human rights in Spain, was following an investigation of the disappearance of Spanish citizens during the Pinochet regime, particularly at the time of the coup d'etat. He managed to get an order from the Spanish courts for arrest of General Pinochet. But he was not in Spain, he was in London. So he commissioned Interpol to arrest. And Interpol contacted Scotland Yard in London. And Home Security, Jack Straw was the Minister of Home Security in the UK at the time, the Labour government. They say, okay, let's go with the arrest. And they arrest Pinochet in London on a request from Judge Garzón in Spain because of human rights violations in Chile.
What was the reaction like in Chile at that time?
Well, I was living in the US at the time. And so I followed from there. It was a shock, an internal shock. And people was happy or expectant of what was to happen to Pinochet, but there was a group also, the right wing, etc., that were upset and couldn't understand how he could be arrested, etc. So it started to convince the Tony Blair government in the UK to release Pinochet, which did happen at the end. But he was for 18 months under custody. And then he returned to Chile. But the commitment was that he was to be under judicial investigation in Chile. That was return us General Pinochet, we will judge him here in Chile. That was the official position of the government, but which did not take place. He never spent a day in jail in Chile because he passed away in 2006. But he was not senator for life anymore. He was interrogated, etc., but he never spent a single day in jail, so to speak.
Is there a sense that justice wasn't completely served, or is it considered, oh, that was so long in the past, why bother? What was the feeling at the time?
No. I think because this year we are celebrating, so to speak, remembering the 50 years of the coup d'etat, because the coup d'etat was 73 and now we are 2023. So I think this is still very much in the memory. The coup d'etat, the violation of human rights, the fact that the Chile democracy broke down, that there was a tough military government, Pinochet figure, still very much alive here. But you think that this happened too much back in history, nobody will care. No, it's not the situation.
So he's still casting a shadow over Chilean culture and society.
Yeah, I think the problem is that Chile restored democracy, but it was a negotiated restoration of democracy because the military, unlike in Argentina after the defeat of Malvinas, the military in the 82, 83, when they left power in Argentina, military junta, military dictatorship, was a defeated military because they lost the Malvinas with Great Britain. In Chile, Pinochet left in an election. He remained in Congress. The Constitution, Chile has the 1980 Constitution in place that was approved under the Pinochet regime, subject to several amendments, but the Constitution is the same. We don't have a new Constitution. Now there is a Constitutional Convention, etc. But the Chilean transition tied the hands of the new democratic actors in terms of the Constitution was the same. The economic model was not to be changed substantially. No massive prosecutions of human rights. There was some prosecution and there are former offenders in jail still, but General Pinochet was never touched. So the whole transition had these characteristics. Transition from authoritarian rule to democratic rule.
All right. Well, any final words you want to say on this as far as Pinochet or looking to the future? What are Chile's hopes and aspirations for the future?
Yeah, well, what happened to Chilean democracy was very tragic in 1973 because there was a possibility of internal settlement, democratic settlement to the crisis that was leaving the country in the final month of the Allende government. But the fact of choosing or the military intervention, the role of the U.S., at that time with Kissinger and Nixon is important also to consider because there were the years of the Cold War, etc. So Chile was under the influence more of the U.S. at the time in South America. Then it's important when you evaluate economic reforms in Chile, economic performance, that you take also this political economy, the issue of democracy, and the fact that the neoliberal economics was applied under military rule, and then continue afterwards the neoliberal model, but without authoritarian politics, more democratic politics. The problem now, as I see, is that the country, after 50 years of neoliberal, or around 50 years, 40, 50, of the neoliberal model, still is a country with high levels of inequality of income, wealth, and opportunities. This is a problem for the future in Chile, because it's difficult to build cohesive, peaceful, harmonious societies if you have too much economic inequality. Unfortunately, Chile has remained a very unequal country, though progress in the macroeconomic area have taken place. We are a country of relatively low inflation, financial stability, export-led development, etc. been economic development, but the social side of these economic outcomes, not good. So I see that the legacy of the neoliberalism in Chile is that. Inequality, employment vulnerability, very high differences between social groups in terms of economic well-being and wealth distribution. This, looking in a long-run perspective, in retrospect, this is a lesson of the last 50 or more years of the history of Chile, economic history and political history. Also, the importance of preserving the memory of human rights, I think, is very important, because there are groups that are relatively say, no, this happened 50 years ago, let's forget, let's turn the page, what happened, happened. But I don't think this is a positive and constructive position. I think you have to reckon with the history of your country if you want to build a more fair society, a stable society, and democratic society. It's very important to protect democracy, because in Chile, like in other countries, there is an emergence of extreme right positions that you have to be careful with that. And unfortunately, they have got support in last elections. Still, the country is a democratic country, but those tendencies you have to watch.
Yeah. So what's next for you? Are you working on any projects, any books coming out?
Well, I am publishing a book with Cambridge University Press on an evaluation of the last 60 years of the Chilean economy, which more or less touch upon the issue that we have discussed this afternoon. More probably about the economic part than the political or this dimension. So that's a book, and also I'm writing a book on the more academic book on the macroeconomics of John Maynard Keynes. But on Chile, I'm writing. It will be published, I think, by the end of this year, early 2024. This book with Cambridge University Press on 50 years of neoliberal economics in Chile.
I look forward to it. Also, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Brad, for a great conversation. And I hope this can motivate further exchanges and debates in other countries, in other contexts, out of the Chilean experience. I think it's very important that this reality is also discussed in the U.S. because the role the U.S. has played in different dimensions to the Chilean history of the last half century.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, sir. Take care.
Hey, all best. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this interview, be sure to like and subscribe. Regimes Museum is a non-profit educational institution that studies the phenomenon of tyranny and dictatorship across history and culture. Find out more at www.regimes.museum.org.